Alright guys, so today we're gonna talk about Aesir and Vanir Titans. Because as far back as the RPG lore, and it is canonized in other ways in the game, there have been different types of titanic beings. And these types of titanic beings can actually be identified by their skin color. And when you look at Titanforged, there actually was a war between Aesir and Vanir Titanforged, which is very interesting because it does canonize the concept of Aesir and Vanir in the game. But there's also a quest, which I'm going to go find after we watch some stuff, that that points to not just the Titanforged being Aesir and Vanir. There's some evidence to support, and it's actually written in the RPG lore as well, but there's new evidence in Dragonflight that actually supports the idea that the Titans too are Aesir and Vanir. And when you look at the Titans, Titan Pantheon, wow, you can actually very easily see which ones are Aesir and which ones are Vanir, because the Aesir ones have silver skin or platinum skin, and the Vanir ones have the bronze skin. It's very clear which ones are Aesir and which ones are Vanir, which is interesting because when you look at these four characters, they're all characters that in some capacity can be linked to at least trying to do the right thing in some way. These three back here kind of all seem like dickheads. And they all have silver skin, the Arcane Masters. They're Aesir and they're different from the others. I would also say that even Aeonar looks slightly different from the other Vanir, but this is all backed up and actually confirmed by the RPG lore. So in the RPG, it actually does say that Aman'thul, Golganath, and Norgannon are Aesir Titans, and that that Khazgaroth, Aeonar, and Agramar are Vanir. It says that Sargeras, who is a demon lord now, used to be a Vanir Titan, which is what's depicted here. And it's really important that we identify them as Aesir Vanir because they're, like I said, their skin allows us to identify what they are. And I think that that's important as well because when you look at Argus the Unmaker, he doesn't have bronze or silver skin. And so it makes me wonder if he's either of them, you know? Is that thing even a Titan at that point? It's not Aesir, it's not Vanir. Vanir, what the fuck is it? Isn't it weird that there are more Vanir Titans? Before you get ahead of yourself, let's learn about the Aesir-Vanir War.
The war I remember, the first in the world, when the gods with spears had smitten Galvig, and in the hall of Hor had burned her, 3 times burned, and 3 times born.
Buckle up.
Thanks again to the God of War team for sponsoring this episode and making this brief overview of the Norse worlds possible.
I don't know why he uses a voice modulator, or they, or whatever, but they are, and I don't understand it, but they are, so.
Supporters of our Extra History Patreon recently helped us fund a short experimental run for an extra mythology series. We've got 4 episodes on Greek mythology coming out later this year, but the God of War folks heard about it and offered to sponsor 2 additional episodes early. So today, we bring you the Aesir-Vanir War, sponsored by the God of War team, courtesy of Norse mythology. 2 races of gods there are, 2 races of gods there will always be. For most of time, they've lived in harmony, but once this was not the case. Once there was a war like no other war, for it was a war between the gods. It was the first war, the conflict that invented war, and there will be no other like it until Ragnarok comes. This was a war over magic, because the weave of fate is not as fixed as you might think. You see, the gods as we know them, the Aesir, Odin, and all of his kin, were going about their business when they spotted a lone figure walking up the road to Asgard. It was a sorceress who offered her services to the divine host. At first, they marveled at her wisdom and her skill.
I'm gonna be honest, there's different ways you can interpret this, but this sorceress that they're referring to, I think that there's a lot of hinting, and I will back this up with some evidence following this, that this sorceress is Aeonar.
Spotted a lone figure walking up the road to Asgard. It was a sorceress who offered her services to the divine host. At first, they marveled at her wisdom and her skill, for as the Norns weave fate, so can others unweave it. And this sorceress, with spindle and distaff, would respin the fates of those who requested it. This was a great temptation for the gods.
You can also look at it as Elune. Elune's another possibility as well.
For the one thing the Aesir could not overcome was fate. And while the sorceress could not make extreme changes, for none can truly do much to warp the weave that the Norns create, even her subtle alterations to fate were something worth coveting. Soon, the Aesir put her talent to petty uses, and began to bicker amongst themselves. As the tension between the Aesir grew, they began to think that perhaps the sorceress was trying to set them against one another. So they caught her and bound her, and brought her to a great hall. Thrice they tied her to a pyre, and thrice she burned. Thrice she burned, and thrice she was born again. They realized that they could not kill her, so she was released. But she was no mere sorceress. She was Freya of the Vanir.
Here it is. This is why this is part of why I'm stuck between Azeroth and Aeonar on this one, because Freya is literally the fucking keeper of Aeonar.
And this attempted execution could not be—
That third death, I thought it was Sylvanas. Each quote refers to like 6 different scenarios. I hope you guys realize that. That each one of those quotes applies to like at least 3 different characters, 3 different situations. All of them do. So to think that they only apply to one single character is probably a mistake. And it's not really how the Void operates. The Void is all about possibility and option for truth. It's not about one single choice. So I don't really agree with that.
Easily forgiven. The Aesir and Vanir each succumbed to fear, and from fear there came hate. Soon, war was inevitable. The wall that protected Asgard was overthrown, and the hosts lined up on that immortal realm's fields. With a bellow, Odin flung his mighty spear, and the battle was joined. The Aesir fought with martial valor and weapons of war, mighty and well-crafted. The Vanir fought with cryptic arts and the old lore of magic. Each side did the other great hurt. Each side fought with savagery and skill, but the 2 sides were evenly matched. Neither set of gods was greater than the other. So, after much time and much devastation, a weariness of war took them. The wise, on both sides, saw that there could be no winner to this match, and so they proposed a truce. As was the custom, the sides met and offered to exchange hostages to ensure that the truce would last. The Vanir offered up Freya and her brother Freyr, as well as a sea god named Njord. And
a sea god? Oh, that's interesting. Because we have Golganeth as one of the Aesir, who is literally the Lord of Sea and Skies.
As the custom, the sides met and offered to exchange hostages to ensure that the truce would last. The Vanir offered up Freya and...
So we've talked about the possibility of Aeonar not necessarily making sense as part of the pantheon of order. And to a degree that may be the case, but the exchange of kind of war prisoners in this sense is very important.
Match. And so they proposed a truce. As was the custom, the sides met and offered to exchange hostages to ensure that the truce would last. The Vanir offered up Freya and her brother Freyr, as well as a sea god named Njord. And the Aesir, in turn, offered up Honir and Mimir as hostages. The Vanir hostages were welcomed by the Aesir, and soon became permanent members of the pantheon that lived in Asgard. The Aesir hostages, too, were welcomed by the Vanir, who found themselves to be much enriched because Honir seemed wise beyond reckoning. Any problem they had, they would bring to him, and he would solve it for them. Soon, he was elevated to being one of the highest counselors among the Vanir. But the Vanir began to notice something odd. When Mimir wasn't with Honir, Honir would simply answer, "Let someone else decide," to any question asked of him. They realized they had been tricked. Honir was not a worthy hostage, but rather a simpleton the Aesir were trying to pawn off on them, and they had sent Mimir to help perpetuate the ruse. So they caught Mimir, cut off his head, and as a sign of their displeasure, sent it back to the faithless Asgardians. Odin was distraught. A lover of wisdom, he could not lose the sage advice of Mimir, so he embalmed the head and used his most powerful magic to imbue it with the power of speech. Whenever Asgard was faced with a problem too great for even Odin's wisdom, Odin would lift up the head and ask its advice. So once again, the Aesir and the Vanir came together to try to work out a pact of peace. Rather than exchange hostages, this time they all took a ritual pledge. Each chewed a berry and then spat its juice into a bowl. This juice was then fermented and became the being known as Kvasir, wisest of all that ever were. Kvasir would give out his wisdom to all freely, solving problems and resolving disputes wherever he went. But one day on his travels, he ran into two dwarves who asked for his assistance. When they had lured him into private by asking for his counsel, they slew him and strung him up and drained his body of its blood. When the Aesir searched for Kvasir, the dwarves told them that he had choked on his own wisdom and died. With his death, the last remnant of the Aesir-Vanir war passed from this world. But there is one last legacy it's left us. For those dwarves mixed honey with Kvasir's blood, and made from it a mead which they did not drink, but rather hoarded away. After changing hands many times, Odin at last came by it, and drank full from it, and in doing so, introduced poetry into the world. And thus, the First War ended. Thanks again to the God of War team for sponsoring this video. If you want to learn more about God of War before it...
One thing that there's some things that are kind of left out here. Okay, listen to this. In Norse mythology, the Aesir-Vanir War was a conflict between two groups of deities that ultimately resulted in the unification of the Aesir and the Vanir into a single pantheon, which is what we see in our game. The war is an important event in Norse mythology, and the implications for the potential historicity surrounding accounts of the war are a matter of scholarly debate and discourse. So, this is the Poetic Edda. This is actually talking about Gullveig, so listen to this. In two stanzas of Voluspa, the war is recounted by a Volva, who refers to herself here in the third person, while the god, I'm assuming this is Odin questions her. The war is told rather vaguely, and the fact that it describes a war between the Aesir and Vanir is not completely certain. In the first of the two stanzas, the Vulva says that she remembers the first war in the world, when Gullveig was stabbed with spears and then burnt 3 times in one of Odin's halls. Now, I think this is very interesting, Lord Daron's sigil, because we have different imagery in the game of 3 spears being driven into something. The crest of Lordaeron is one of them. Boom, boom, boom. We've also seen this on other things as well. I want to say it's on the Scepter of Sargeras appearances. And so it could mean something. It could mean absolutely nothing. It's on one of these appearances. Is it this one? I don't know if that's the right one. But the there's one of them that's got it, I'm pretty sure. But oh, it's this one right here. You have the 3 nails that like go into the top of the rod right there. It's like 3 nails driven into it, similar to the Lordaeron symbol. But it might mean nothing. But on the Lordaeron throne room floor, and also in Icecrown Citadel, there's this thing on the ground, which also depicts that same Lordaeron symbol. But I think that this symbol is depicting something on a grander scale, like some kind of it's more than just like a thing on the floor. You know what I mean? Like this means something. Xalatath, yeah, I think so. Blade of the Black Empire, I want to say also has that. Yeah, similar in the hilt. The spikes being driven in on the curve. Yep. I can get behind that. I can fuck with that. But let's keep reading, because that's just a side point. Just makes me think of it in the moment. Listen, in the first 2 of the stanzas, she says she remembers the first war when Gullveig was stabbed with spears and then burnt 3 times in one of Odin's halls, yet that Gullveig was reborn 3 times. And that's interesting because, again, we have that quote, at the hour of her 3rd death, she ushers in our coming. Very interesting. 3 times burned and 3 times born. Often again, yet ever she lives. In the second stanza, the Volva says that they called Gullveig Heor, meaning bright one, which is interesting, or potentially gleaming or honor. Whenever she came to houses, that she was a wise Volva, and that she cast spells. Heor performed Seor where she could, did so in a trance, and was always the favorite of wicked women. That's an interesting one. Hythe they named her, who sought their home, the wide-seeing witch, in magic wise. Minds she bewitched, that were moved by her magic. To evil women a joy she was. And this, dude, I read Seor, I was like, what is this? In Old Norse, Seor, sometimes angelicized as satyr, was a type of magic which was practiced in Norse society during the late Scandinavian Iron Age. The practice of Seor is believed to be a form of magic which was related to both the telling and the shaping of the future. Connected to the Old Norse religion, its origins are largely unknown, and the practice of it gradually declined after the Christianization of Scandinavia. Accounts of Seor later made it into the sagas and literary sources, while further evidence of it has been unearthed by archaeologists, etc., etc. It's believed to come from Proto-Germanic seos, cognate with Lithuanian saitas, Thai, tether, Proto-Celtic, sorcery, etc., leading to, all derived from Proto-Indo-European, ultimately from the Indo-European root to bind. To bind. To bind. In the Viking Age, the practice of Seor by men had connotations of unmanliness or effeminacy, known as ergi, blah 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 blah. Freya, or perhaps some of the other goddesses of Norse mythology, were Seor practitioners. Odin was accused by Loki in the Lokasena of being unmanly, to which Odin replied with, "Knowest thou that I gave to those I ought not, victory to cowards? Thou was 8 winters on the earth below, milked cow as a woman, and didst there bear children. Now that, methinks, betokens a base nature." So, essentially, this fucking magic that is used by a being called the Bright One sometimes, also from the root word to bind, shares similarities with the goddess Freya, which is the name of the keeper Eonar in our fucking world. Gulveig is a female figure in Norse mythology associated with the legendary conflict between the Aesir and Vanir. Very important because in the RPG lore Shadows and Light, it actually talks about how long had Aman'thul and Sargeras, his brother, quarreled and fought, and that the presence of Eonar exacerbated the conflict. In the poem Voluspa, she came to the hall of Odin, Har, where she is speared by the Aesir, burnt 3 times, and yet thrice reborn. Upon her 3rd rebirth, she began practicing Seor and took the name Heor. So upon her 3rd rebirth, the hour of her 3rd death, she ushers in our coming. She starts practicing Seor, a magic that has the power to both tell and shape the future. That's pretty big. Seor was taught to Odin by Freya to basically mind control stuff. And I think that whether Eonar is doing it out of being bad or not is still something that can be discussed. As a Scandinavian, it makes me happy to see some Norse lore. Well, I'm starting to think, guys, that we might have been a little bit in the wrong direction in terms of which pantheon of gods the Titans are really inspired from. Like, there's always been a lot of linking to the Greek pantheon, which I don't think is necessarily wrong. I just think it's a lot of Norse that has kind of been overlooked, even and often by myself. So, really important here that this is what was occurring. Now let's read about Freya real quick. Because we're on Aesir Vanir War. So check this out. There were some other things I wanted to read about them. It's really important about how they act. So it's saying down here, as the Vanir are often considered fertility gods, the Aesir Vanir War has been proposed as a reflection of the invasion of local fertility cults somewhere in the regions inhabited by the Germanic peoples by a more aggressive warlike cult through Indo-Europeans. This is important because it actually Aesir are gods in Germanic paganism and Old Nordic religion and mythology. The precise meaning of the term Aesir is debated, with it being able to refer to both gods in general or specifically to one of the main families of gods, in contrast to the Vanir, with whom they waged war, ultimately leading to a joining of the families. The term can further be used to describe local gods that were believed to live in specific features in the landscape, such as fells. Oh, it says right here, proposed origins of a distinction with Vanir. Despite the inclusion to some extent of the Vanir within the wider group of Aesir, some scholars have argued that some differences between the two groups remain, such as the Vanir appearing to have mainly been connected with cultivation and fertility, and the Aesir with power and war. Conversely, it has been argued that this division of domains is not reflected in the sources, with the Vanir being instead more associated with kingship and the Aesir with creation. One idea is that the Vanir and the fertility cult associated with them may be more archaic than that of the more warlike Aesir, such that the mythical war may mirror a half-remembered religious conflict. This argument was first suggested by Wilhelm Manhart in 1877. On a similar note, Marija Gimbutas argues that the Aesir and Vanir represent the displacement of an indigenous Indo-European group by a warlike tribe. Okay, we read that. Another historical theory is that the inter-pantheon interaction may be an apotheosization of the conflict between the Roman kingdom and the Sabines. Given the difference between their roles and emphasis, some scholars have speculated that the interactions between the Aesir and the Vanir reflect the types of interaction that were occurring between social statuses or clans within Norse society at the time. Finally, the noted comparative religion scholar Mircea Eliade, I hope I say that right, Eliade, speculated that this conflict is actually a later version of an Indo-European myth concerning the conflict between an eventual integration of a pantheon of sky, warrior, and ruler gods, and a pantheon of earth, economics, and fertility gods, with no strict historical antecedents, which is, I think that's absolutely fascinating, because it's really like, the speculation about the actual mythos itself jumps into the ideas of like, where is this actually rooted from? And to remember that it's rooted from peoples is, I think, important. The picture of Odin on that wiki in the top kind of looks like Aman'thul, the map with the lightning bolt. When you look at them, it's like I said before, it's really easy to tell who's Aesir and who's Vanir. Aesir, 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 Vanir, Vanir, Vanir. Maybe Vanir become Aesir as Eonar. But regardless, by looking at the skin color, you would say Vanir. The quests in that area are quite telling. Yeah, I'm excited. Hope you're doing great. Thanks, Elementalis. So is this our Pantheon and the Shadow Pantheon made prisoner trade theory? I think that there's been gods shuffled around, yes. I think that I have literally irrefutable proof that the Primus has interacted with Norganon and Eonar. It's like not even a discussion in terms of whether or not it's provable or whether or not it's real. The Rune Carver has memories of them. It's why people want to try to separate all the pantheons and stuff like they're different things, but they're not realizing that, like, what we're told exists as the pantheon of gods is like a fucking melting pot of different gods. They're not all naturally beings of order, I'm pretty sure. And it's funny that the Aesir are more warlike. It's so important that the distinction between Aesir and Vanir is noted, because it talks about the Vanir, the bronze gods, as being more like cultivation, fertility, maybe something more archaic and older. Whereas these fucking guys, the Aesir, are more about war and, in some ways, like, I don't want to say magic. With that Norse mind control magic being taught to Odin, right? Yeah, and that's the thing is, Freya is the keeper of Eonar, and Odin is the keeper of Aman'thul. I just think that's really fucking interesting because, as I have posited, Aman'thul literally, I think that these guys have literally bound and dominated these two. And the fact that the fucking magic is literally its root is to bind. The fact that ANR's title is the Life Binder, it makes me think like, wait a second.